we like to refer to our studies as the world's largest studies, but it's more related to the way that we do our studies. So typically when people do studies like this, they're survey based. That's not how SWOOP does our benchmarking. We actually look at every digital interaction that our benchmarking partners have made during the period that we looked at. We looked at a 3-month period during COVID up to the end of February. And, you know, we discovered something like nearly 100,000 teams over the 33 organisations that agreed to participate. All the data is anonymous, so we don't see people's names. We don't even see the team's names or anything like that. We just see IDs and so forth. So just to put this in context, when Gallup runs its world poll, if you like, worldwide poll, they take input from something like 200,000 people. We took input from 320,000 people. So if you like, it is a very big study. We look very much in depth at what people are actually doing. We don't have anything against surveys, but we think that you really need this total complementary view to understand the real truth of what's actually going on. So let's move into some of the insights that we found. Okay, so the first one is maybe not unexpected, and then when we were forced into lockdown, people went directly into the sort of what were formerly the Skype functions of calls, chats and meetings. Probably what did surprise us a bit was the extent of that. So the 3-month period we looked at, for the larger organisations, probably around 90% of the people didn't actually move beyond that function. They were basically using the telephony functions. Now, Genevieve spoke about the richness of Teams. Well, in essence, only about 10% of the people were actually looking at that part. So that surprised us a bit. So if we look at the overall number of messages, 28 times as many chat messages as channel messages, that gives you a bit of a picture of what that was sort of looking like. Now, that sort of is an issue, I think, moving forward. We did do some surveying in our study, and we did see that people were getting ready to move beyond telephony now, which is good news. But remember, if you stay in the telephony, you're not actually making use of the richness of Teams as a hub. You're not actually sharing documents. You're not operating as digital teams. You're not actually adding other apps into your workspace. You're just doing what you would have done before with Skype, for example. So we think that's a real opportunity that I think companies are getting ready for that now, which is quite good. The other thing that we were told was that chat they were saying that their email, a lot of our case study participants were saying that the email level, the internal email in particular, was actually going down, right? So, and they're assuming that was being because we're doing more chatting and we're doing more channel messaging. Unfortunately, the reason why people don't really like email is because it's often one-on-one. It's sort of a lot of things aren't being shared in email, and but if we're replacing that with one-on-one chat, we haven't really actually improved the situation, have we? So what we found was that, whilst in chat you can have multi-person chat, only about 2% of all chats were actually multi-person. So most of the chat was one-on-one, so if you look at that situation, that can be very dangerous, if you like. So in our sample, I guess we had 7 consulting companies who were acting as subject matter experts, but they're also acting as subjects. And when we look at their data, they weren't working in chat, they were working in the channel. So the unequivocal advice was that don't work in chat, right? So this is something that's coming out. Don't work in chat, do your work in the channels, because you get the full richness of Teams when you're doing that. So that's just a bit of a warning about, it's nice to see the email levels go down, but don't replace them with something that's actually worse. Now, finally, on the general insights, of course, we would expect that the activity levels in Teams will go up during COVID. And of course, we saw that, so what we see what we've seen reported in the press repeatedly is that people are just dying of this digital overload, right? We're just being killed by overload. What we found was that actually wasn't the case, right? So when you look at everybody that's operating, we see this long tail effect that we see in the digital world, that it's really only the top 5–10% that are actually really sort of using it heavily. The other 90% are really quite comfortable, so we turn that up, and in fact we have a section on stress and workplace stress, and we talk about challenge stress and chronic stress. I think you'll enjoy reading that part, because that talks about how people are, if they're really stressed or not, and we find that they're actually more challenged than stressed. So let's just move on to some specific teams insights. So it's not that people didn't try and use the teams, right? With 100,000, we found 100,000 teams, if you like, that have been created through those 33 organisations. But we only found that we found that in that period of 3 months, only about 26% actually had any activity in that time. So like 70% weren't actually even active in the 3-month period we looked at. They were still there, but they weren't active. Then we looked at that 26%, we found that only, I think it was like 3% of all the teams, were actually meaningfully active. And when we say meaningfully, we set the filter at, they had to have at least 3 people active, and they had to do at least 1 interaction a working day. So that's not a very high filter. And we found that took us way back to only 3% of those, less than 3% of those 100,000 teams. But nevertheless, that was still a big number of teams, nearly 3,000 teams. We analysed those in more detail. Now, again, to put this in context, organisations that have done this passive monitoring, people like Google published a big study a few years ago about doing this sort of passive analysis of their teams. They used 180 teams, right? So we still looked at nearly 3,000 teams. And then we picked out the top 10% of those. It was actually 273,000 teams. And these are the ones that we wanted to look at in detail. And then we looked at the organisations that had those teams in there, and we went actually to them and we asked them, could we talk to some of their high performing teams that we'd identified? Now, remember, for us, it's anonymous, right? So we don't know their names or anything like that. They often didn't even know who they were. They could see who they were, and they would say, some of the bigger organisations would say, well, we don't actually know about that team, but we can contact them for you, and let's see if we can organise a meeting with them. And thankfully, we're able to do that. So 12 of the organisations, or 12 of the teams, are featured in the report. So Sharon has put together, I think it's over 30 pages of case studies of these teams, really high performing, really inspirational. When you look at them, they're doing things that you just couldn't have done in an office environment. And what was pleasing to me is that we've been working on these ranking algorithms that we've drawn decades of research into, and then customized our measures of what good looks like in teams. And it was pleasing to me to be able to say, well, when we picked these teams up, they were actually very transformational. The algorithm was doing the right thing. It was picking out good teams, and I think you'll enjoy reading their stories. I guess the final point is that last year, when we first built our algorithms, we found that only about 20% of people were working in the same way that the researchers were telling us high-performing teams should be acting. And that's really self-directed, operational, interacting, cohesive, all of those sorts of things, agile, all the things that we hear about in the press. These teams were doing that, right? So last year, about 20% of the teams we found were working that way. This year, with a much bigger sample, we're looking at about 40%, right? So we're moving in the right direction. Digital teams are becoming self-directed. They're doing the right things. And I'd expect as we go forward, we'll see more and more and more of that.